Hello again, everyone. My name is Emma, and for this presentation, I'll be conducting an analysis of Dr. Charlotte Horlyck's journal article about Gilded Celadon from the Koryo kingdom. Based on my research, Dr. Horlyck seems like a pretty fun person, actually. Certainly, she's very knowledgeable about Korean art and culture, both pre and postmodern. Prior to receiving her PhD, she worked as a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and shortly after completing her PhD at SOAS of London, she was appointed there as a lecturer. The only problem here is what exactly SOAS stands for, which is School of Oriental and African Studies. Right away, the word Oriental sets off some red flags, and interestingly enough, it was actually quite difficult for me to find what the acronym stands for. It's not explained anywhere on the school's website. I had to go somewhere else to find it, so it almost seems like maybe they're aware and a little embarrassed of it. But the actual argument of this piece is a little vague. It's more of a deep dive into the subject of Gilded Celadon as a whole, as compared to like a question and answer type thing. I think the purpose of this paper is partially just to bring more attention and scholarship forward on the topic, because as I soon found out, the existing information about Gilded Celadon from Koryo, Korea is extremely limited. But before I go any further into the analysis, I'll go ahead and establish some terminology. Most of these words won't actually come up in my discussion, but were ones that were important to know while I was reading Dr. Horlyck's paper. Gilded is a pretty standard term, but since it's so essential to this paper, I went ahead and put it up there just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And next, and you'll have to excuse my poor Korean pronunciation, is the term sangam, which is just the native word for this method of decoration. Quatrefoil refers to a certain shape of decorative element which is used a lot on these pieces. Then there's sagar, which is a word I had never heard before, but it's just a container to house ceramic pieces during firing. Then we have crazing, which is just a specific term to refer to these type of cracks in the ceramics glaze. The big theme of this paper is how incredibly sparse the surviving evidence of Gilded Celadon from the Koryo period is. Since she mentioned the Victoria and Albert Museum as being the only Western museum to house one of these pieces, I decided to use their site as an example. So if you go and look for just regular Celadon from Koryo, Korea, the search returns more than 100 results. But if you add the term gilded to the search, you will get exactly one result, just to give you an idea of how little we actually have to work with here. Since Dr. Horlyck used to work for the Victoria and Albert Museum, I assumed her research would involve a little more like first-hand analysis of the one gilded piece they have, but it really didn't, which is fine. Instead, she mainly relies on cross-referencing historical documents, modern research, and then her own understanding of Korean history and culture during the Koryo period. The paper explores just about everything there is to know about these gilded pieces, which, like I said, is surprisingly limited, but I'm gonna recount a few reasons first why there is so little known about them. Interestingly enough, one of the main reasons is a result of a scientific process rather than like a purely human one. In order to keep the gold-painted design from fusing and blurring into the overglaze, the Korean potters had to mix the gold-powdered pigment with some kind of organic binding agent prior to firing it. So while this technique maintained the clarity of the image in the gold design, it means that the gold pigment would sit on top of the glaze as opposed to being sealed underneath it or fused with it. This means that the gold paint easily rubs off over time, making it even harder to identify even the few surviving examples of having been gilded at one point. So here you can see just a tiny remaining flecks of gold paint on the one bowl stand from the Victoria and Albert Museum. Adding to the confusion are endless number of copycat pieces, mostly from Japan, that were meant to look like Korean Celadon. A surge in the demand for Koryo Celadon from collectors prompted a lot of opportunistic kiln owners in Japan to produce their own Gilded Celadon, some more convincingly than others. In fact, although the bowl in the top right is widely considered to be of authentic Korean origin, Dr. Horlyck points out that the plum blossom motif would have been completely uncharacteristic of Korean Celadon from the Koryo area. So even that is still up for debate. Another factor that played into the disappearance of Gilded Celadon was the frenzied looting of Korean burial mounds and graves following the accidental discovery of an aristocratic tomb in the 1880s. While the looting certainly is unfortunate, the discovery of the tombs did provide two important clues to the study of Gilded Celadon. One, the discovery of the inclusion of Gilded Celadon in the graves of the rich and elite implies that not only they were highly valued during the Goryeo period, but that their production was certainly far more limited than that of other ceramics. The second, slightly more hopeful information gained from this discovery is the fact that there may very well still be Goryeo era graves that are undiscovered, which means there's a potential for more gilded pieces to be uncovered and examined. Despite there being very few Gilded Celadon vessels from this period left to analyze, Dr. Horlyck does manage to establish a list of motifs that are shared between them, which she uses to distinguish authentic examples from replications. My knowledge of Goryeo Korean culture is pretty limited, but Horlyck asserts that these motifs are characteristic of Korean cultural parameters during that time. The final piece, and the one that is particularly interesting to me as someone who studies Buddhist art, is the link that she draws between these Gilded Celadon pieces and these famously sought after illuminated sutras that were also being produced in the Koryo kingdom. Illustrated sutras were treasured among all Buddhist cultures, but the gold-inked illuminated paintings and sutras were particularly prized in Korea, and leading to an increase in their manufacture around the 13th, 14th century. Horlyck identifies numerous similarities in the gilding techniques on these illuminated manuscripts and that of the few surviving gold-painted Celadon pieces. And she speculates that the monks who were so trained and specialized in this type of gilding were probably so many and so talented that they may very well have been the ones who also applied this final gold paint into the etched designs of the Celadon pieces prior to firing. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised with this piece. Despite my concern at first about the antiquated Orientalism prompted by the name of her school, Dr. Horlyck did a great job exploring every corner of this topic, but in a way that was easy to digest. I could only come up with two critiques. First being the sort of sporadic nature of the structure. Throughout the whole thing, she sort of jumps from topic to topic in a way where the sections become almost independent from each other. And there were several sections I thought could have been rearranged just to make the whole thing flow a little better. My final thought is that here or there I came across a date or an attribution that don't quite match up to what is listed on other resources, which I could excuse if something changed between when this was published in 2012 and now, but they seem to maybe have been incorrect even at the time that she wrote this. But again, I'm not an expert, that's just my thinking. And that's it. Celadon is my favorite type of ceramics, so it was really interesting to take a deep dive into this very specific facet of the history of Celadon. Thanks for watching!